$300. Even I make more money than that. I mean, that's not funny. You're talking about people, literally starving to death. And hundreds of millions of human beings, possibly billions, in the non-capitalist world subsist on less than $1 per day. In the late 19th century, European colonialists conquered large parts of Asia and Africa. But despite their often brutal rule, they at least built infrastructure and improved the local economies, especially the British. For example, much of British colonial Africa was transformed during the colonial period. Education was significantly improved, railways and roads were built, incidences of lethal diseases were reduced, and slavery, slave trading, and famine were practically eliminated. When the colonialists packed their bags and went home in the years following World War II, local economic development generally ceased. All that remained was a vastly worse brutality. For example, China, North Korea, Vietnam, and Cambodia regressed into the most repressive totalitarian system of human history, communism, which murdered 100 million innocent victims in 80 years, most of them in the aforementioned Asian countries. At the same time, African nations, ruled by an endless succession of dictators, whether of a socialist, military, or tribal variety, wallowed in one form of repression or another. Whether incessant civil warfare, Somalia, unspeakable tribal slaughter, Rwanda, endless persecution, murder, and enslavement of at least tens of thousands of blacks, Sudan, mind-boggling corruption, Zaire under Mobutu, theft of privately owned farms and resultant famine, Zimbabwe under Mugabe, etc. Many African peoples today are far less free under brutal indigenous dictators than they were under British colonial rule. More than 225 years after the American Revolution, freedom is virtually unknown around the globe. Now, I regard that as a tragic fact, so I'm going to repeat that. More than 225 years after the American Revolution, freedom is virtually unknown around the globe. But very quietly, the post-World War II period also gave rise to profoundly positive developments. The great moral political struggle of the era was capitalism versus communism, freedom versus totalitarianism, individualism versus collectivism. Not all the starving third world countries were conquered by the communists. Some, protected by America and her allies, were able to live in freedom. And because they were free, they were able to choose, to decide between the opposing systems of capitalism and socialism. The most historic, important, and positive developments in the world in the past 50 years is the spread of capitalism into the non-Western countries of the third world. This phenomenon, too rarely discussed in our schools, universities, and media, is the single greatest hope for world peace and prosperity. The destitute countries of Asia led the way. The shining light of late 20th century global capitalism and the paradigm for the subsequent Asian tigers was Japan. American occupation of Japan under General Douglas MacArthur transformed the country from a brutal military dictatorship into the freest country of Asia. I would say into the freest country in the history of Asia. The Japanese Constitution of 1947, drawn up at MacArthur's headquarters, helped establish a limited government in that country. In conjunction with other laws of American occupation, the new Constitution brought freedom and individual rights to Japan for the first time. Economically, the new Japan was established on essentially a free enterprise basis, embodying substantial elements of private ownership of businesses and farms and of profit-seeking. By the early 1950s, Japan's post-war reconstruction was completed, and she stood on the threshold of spectacular economic progress. For the next 20 years, Japan achieved a growth rate that averaged close to 10% annually. Japanese productivity in the late 20th century became legendary because in mere decades, Japan joined the world leaders, in many cases became the world leader in the manufacture of automobiles, watches, radios, televisions, cameras, steel, and such high-tech products as jets, semiconductors, computers, and telecommunications equipment. Today, Japanese per capita GDP is in excess of $40,000, making it truly an economic powerhouse. America had helped create an economic giant, and it was good. The other leading light of post-war global capitalism was Hong Kong, already described. But the growth of Taiwan has been almost as spectacular. In 1949, after the nationalist military defeat on the mainland, the island's per capita income was an abysmal $100. But Chiang Kai-shek, the political leader, sought to create an environment in which entrepreneurs would flourish. He appointed such economic advisors as K.Y. Yin and K.T. Lee, both strong advocates of a free market system. Lee realized that the best thing a government could do was provide a rational legal framework that would establish the rule of law. He proceeded to put himself in the shoes of investors and look at the situation from their perspective. Taiwan opened up to foreign investment and world trade and phased out protectionism, strengthening domestic firms by subjecting them to foreign competition at home. The result of Taiwan's freedom has been a spectacular climb from rags to riches. Its per capita income in 1998 was roughly $14,000, meaning that its wealth had increased 140 times in 50 years. I mean, these are numbers that are just, historically, these are just staggering. Or put in other terms, Taiwan's per capita wealth doubled 7 times during that 50-year period. Communist China, by contrast, was a brutally oppressive dictatorship where Mao Zedong murdered more than 60 million innocent victims, repressed all intellectual dissent and entrepreneurial initiative, caused massive famine and a destitution so pervasive that by the end of his reign in the 1970s, hundreds of millions of Chinese were subsisting on less than $1 a day. China made no economic advances until Deng Xiaoping introduced elements of capitalism into its system in the late 1970s. With farmers allowed some private property on which to grow crops, with special enterprise zones established that permitted a degree of private ownership and profit-seeking, with the country opening to foreign trade, China finally began the agonizing climb out of crushing poverty. Today, China's per capita GDP is $727. Rising slowly from the starvation standards that held under Mao. But despite the intermixture of some free elements, we must understand China remains a brutal dictatorship, and as such it can never equal vastly freer semi-capitalist Taiwan's living standards, much less Hong Kong's. In spite of the pervasive atrocities committed by Mao, the march of global capitalism in Asia could not be halted. Korea divided it in 1945 into freer and totalitarian halves, provided extraordinarily difficult circumstances and a stern test for the budding capitalist system. For one thing, communist North Korea received most of the Japanese-built industry. The freer South got virtually none. For another, South Korea was devastated by the communist invasion of the early 1950s. The war ended in 1953. And it was not until 1963 that the South's per capita GDP reached $100. But in the past 40 years, South Korea's economic progress has been extraordinary. Under the influence of Stanford-trained economist Kim Jae-ik, the South Korean government moved toward privatization and diminished state intervention in the 1980s. Today, South Korea's per capita GDP is in excess of $11,000. An enormous increase over what it was just 40 years ago when it was barely $100. By contrast, the communist North is so primitive that satellite photographs at night reveal mostly darkness because the country lacks electricity. And even massive aid from the United States and other capitalist nations was insufficient to prevent at least tens of thousands of people from starving to death there in the late 1990s. And tens of thousands is a conservative estimate. Additionally, Singapore has also rocketed upward in the past 40 years. Singapore's political leaders began their careers as committed statists and today run a country that is by no means a free society. It has an interventionist government with socialist elements. But at the same time, Singapore provides rock-steady protection of private property rights that attracts significant Western investment. It imposes virtually no tariffs, supports free trade, encourages entrepreneurship, and permits the market to generally set prices. These substantial elements of economic freedom have enabled Singapore, too, to ascend in the past 40 decades into the ranks of the world's wealthiest nations. The title of one